Deep breath. I'm reading this book about mindfulness right now. It's going really well. What if Titanic sank in 1912, but not everybody who died had to die? What if it's still one of the most major maritime disasters of all time, but not because of loss of life, but simply because of the loss of Titanic itself? Today, we are discussing probably the most intriguing what if of this entire series, probably the one that you think about the most if you're a Titaniac, Titanic head, however you self-identify. We are with Pablo to discuss what if Titanic had actually had enough lifeboats. I feel like there should be applause right there. I need to add in like a
Also, I was admiring your ability to take what I said in like 10 words to like a 3 minute intro segment. When you started saying like, what is the Titanic? And I was like, oh my gosh, she's already made the sentence 3 times as long as my version.
this is a skill that I have. I'll leave this part in for the audience. I have this innate skill to turn, like a one sentence concept into a, 15-minute diatribe. I think sometimes it serves me, sometimes it doesn't. I am good at that on the fly. But yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, this is the one. This is definitely the what if episode that I've done in the most prep for, put the most thought into because I think a lot is riding on it. Do you agree? I think in the Titanic world, there's a lot riding on this question.
Well, I think, as you say, it is the question that everybody asks. And if ever you have a conversation with just a passing conversation about Titanic with people who are not deeply invested, like running podcasts about Titanic, they will say if only they had had enough lifeboats, or if only they had enough spaces for everybody on board. So yeah, I think it is the ultimate what if question, I think.
And I think that probably it's weird to say, but probably the best way to go down the road of this question is to first talk about why Titanic didn't have, what we perceive as quote unquote enough lifeboats. Because the definition of what was enough in 1912 is sort of complicated. So I thought we'd do kind of an overview of regulations and circumstances that led to the ship not having enough, which a lot of us know a little bit about already. And there's obviously snide comments about it in the 1997 film and some of the other films. So it's a question lingering even when filmmakers, script all of this out. So first off, very outdated maritime regulations at the time. Now you are Brit, so would you like to talk about what the British Board of Trade regulated at this time? What did that look like in 1912? Like, what was Titanic required to do if she was going to follow the law of the day in Britain?
Well, as the resident Brit, which I'm proud to be at the moment. Yeah, so back then the regulations were essentially on tonnage. So it's funny that when people have this conversation, they often miss out that Titanic actually had more lifeboats than she was required to have at the time, because ships over 10,000 tons were required to carry 16 lifeboats. The problem, of course, was that no one had ever built a ship as big and as heavy as Titanic. So those rules were sort of not updated to reflect that, and is often the case, as still is the case today when you think, I know we've spoken about this before, when you think about the rules and regulations that came in after 9/11. They came in after 9/11 because 9/11 had to happen first before people were like, oh, we should probably tighten up security at airports. And we still live with those rules and regulations today. So it's a similar, Titanic is kind of the 1912 9/11 in that sense, of obviously not a terrorist attack, but in terms of how it triggered all of these updated regulations. So because Titanic was 46,000 tons, um, they she just she just had the lifeboats that she did. She had more than she was required to. And it would have been similar on any other ship of the time, Cunard or White Star Line. So yeah, it was not, it sounds so absurd to say, but they were not required to carry lifeboats per passenger. It was not about having enough.
No one was doing that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
and
was
that
not.
I think that's a common misperception in all of this. Like when a casual Titanic observer it throws around the claim that oh everything would have been fine if they'd just been reasonable and had enough lifeboats. I think they're assuming that other lines at the time were putting enough lifeboats on their ships. They absolutely were not. It's like the Mauritania, the Lusitania, these ships were not, they were not going out with enough lifeboats for one
Well,
passenger either. So it's
and
not,
the thing that you have to remember that is really key here is not just, as you say, that no one else had enough lifeboats. It's that it wasn't ever seen that you would need to be in those lifeboats for very long. The idea was that those lifeboats would ferry you from one ship to another in the event of a disaster because that route was so busy. I'm sure I've said this before, but it's essentially kind of like the New York London route is today on planes. Like it's so busy. The idea that you'd be completely isolated with no help around you had just not entered their mind. So when they planned this out, they thought, well, okay, that's fine because they will just get off Titanic or off this ship and onto another one.
well,
And in reality,
and they had wireless. So I'm
of
sure this
course.
this confidence was further bolstered by the fact that it's this very busy shipping corridor and we have wireless. So surely there'll be a few ships within, 30 minutes to an hour of
Well,
us.
and there was. I was just about to say, I mean, the final piece of that, of course, is that they sort of were right because there was a ship and there were other liners nearby that could have got to them in time had all the other things not happened, like, switching off their wireless early and all this sort of stuff from ships nearby. But it sort of nearly did happen the way in which they intended it to, which is of course Titanic all over, like nearly what ifs and if that had happened and whatever. But like, it's not completely. If you put yourself in the mind of a kind of early 1900s ship designer, it is not completely out of the world to think that exactly what would have happened is what they had planned, and actually it did, sort of.
Yeah.
So it's like it's really hard in today's world because you're thinking with all the context and with all the changes that we now have. But as most people know, especially people listening to this, Titanic is responsible for so many of the rules and regulations that you have to follow when you go on a ship today that we're like, well, of course you have a life jacket, of course you have a lifeboat drill, of course there's enough seats for everybody. Like all of that is so obvious now, but it really was not back then.
No, and if you think about it, a lot of the actions of, say, crew members really reflect this. Like, for example, say, there are these reports of crew members keeping third class passengers down below, debates about whether these doors were locked and such like that. But if you were a crew member and in your mind, the lifeboats are going to be ferry boats, even if you are low in command and you haven't been updated, you are probably standing there thinking, okay, here's what's going to happen. They're going to start ferrying people over to whatever ship comes to our rescue. They are going to ferry probably according to class, because let's be honest, that's likely what would have happened. And so those crew members are likely thinking, okay, so my job is to hold third class kind of in this area until it's their time to go ferry over. And I imagine there were a lot of crew members that until well into the night thought that's what was going on. And it doesn't justify or excuse behavior, but I do think it's important to point out because there are so many accusations that are thrown around that night about crew members. Some of them might have just been operating under, what they thought was standard procedure at the time. And that leads into another reason that it just didn't have many lifeboats is that it was supposed to be quote unquote unsinkable. There was this widespread belief that Titanic was practically unsinkable and that all of the safety features, the watertight compartments, we've talked about those so much, all of this led to a false sense of security and an emphasis on the ship itself as its own lifeboat. And so, because of this, I think everybody just assumed, well, worst case, we have a damaged ship. and we're just going to quietly and calmly get people off of the damaged ship. And, the other interesting thing to think about is that, and I don't know that you and I have ever talked about this, if you are into maritime history at all, which doing this podcast has made me become a little bit so, I am certainly not an expert by any means, and there's probably many listeners listening that are much more so. But, like loading into a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean is not really ever been historically a good idea. Like the idea of a lifeboat has always historically made much more sense like on a lake or maybe on a river. But lifeboats out in the middle of the stormy North Atlantic, no naval, no man out at sea, and even like, the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, on and on, would have ever considered that a good option. I mean, most seamen couldn't even swim. This idea that lifeboats were some fix-all for being out in the middle of the ocean. No, because you might die trying to get in it, and then who's coming to your rescue, particularly before wireless? So I think we put the concept of a lifeboat up on a pedestal that it doesn't deserve to be on at all.
Well, but I think that comes almost directly from Titanic because there is always this conversation. It's like if only they'd had enough lifeboats, that would have solved everything. So yeah, I think you're right, and it is. I mean, the thing is though, is that you can look at that even in a modern day context when you think about the regulations around social media companies. That's a big topic at the moment in the UK, Europe, and the US. Tech companies, AI, government can't keep up with it. And that is always the problem is that there has to be a big disaster before regulations go, okay, right, we've now got to like catch up with this and fix all the stuff. And in the UK, just the other week passed a new law about sort of social media and website barriers. And so there's a lot of protections being put in place, particularly for younger people. But that's taken quite a long time to get there. And in the meantime, it's been spurred on by a number of incidents that happened where the government was like, okay, we've got to find a way of blocking certain websites or restricting certain things. But it doesn't happen organically in the same way that we had to have 9/11, we had to have Titanic, we have to have these moments before something triggers, all of these new rules and regulations and protections.
Mhm. Yeah, and then as a society, we tend to get on our, cute little pedestal and have these grand discussions about what could have been or what should have happened. And, as a historian, I run into this a lot where I even have to catch myself thinking about something in the context of 2025, in terms of the doability of something, in terms of how people might have communicated or interacted. And what I'm actually studying is like 1862. And so I have to have to rewire my brain to think of how someone would have imagined even a simple object, like how I imagine a writing pen is so different than how someone would have imagined a writing pen in whatever year. So I think about this a lot with Titanic. Okay, so we have a sense of why there are not enough lifeboats. The one we really didn't touch on, of course, there's the grand scene in the 97 movie where they're walking on deck, Cal and Rose and Ruth and Mr. Andrews. And, Rose asks, why don't we have enough lifeboats on board? Andrew says, well, we wanted to, we thought about it, but designers and owners wanted the decks to look spacious and uncluttered. Aesthetically, it just wouldn't look as nice. And I think we'll never know for sure. We talked a little bit about it with Ismay, but I think that's a big part of it, and that's it's a rough decision to have to live with the consequences of. Okay, so we've sort of set the scene for why they're not there. Titanic sets sail without enough lifeboats, but more than many ships had at the time, which is why so many people do survive, and we'll talk about that. So I wanted to go down some sort of hypotheticals. What if she had more lifeboats? Where would we have ended up? Number one, would we have more lives saved? The most direct, I think, and significant possible impact is that far more people would have survived. The Titanic carried about, I mean, everyone argues about the exact number, right? 2,224 is pretty accepted. But lifeboats would only accommodate just over 1,100. And so, if there was space for all 2,000 plus people, passengers and crew, I think some people believe that means that all of those people would have survived and been sitting in those boats that night to be rescued by the Carpathia. But this assumes a lot in the operating procedure from the crew and how long the sinking lasts and things like this. So, what are your opening thoughts about what this means? Like, what are your sort of initial reactions to this question about how many more lives would be saved?
I think it's really difficult because we already know that they only managed to launch 18 of the 20 sort of successfully.
Yeah.
And we, of course, know about the upturned lifeboat and the collapsible ones. And so I think it's hard. You have to really kind of put yourself in the minds of senior officers at the time. And so I suppose someone like Andrews, Ismay, Smith, they know they don't have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. So does having enough lifeboats calm everybody down? Because the very senior leadership of the ship um, do not have this sudden, oh my God, we are going to basically kill 1,500 people. So is everything a bit calmer in the sense that they are no longer kind of rushing through things? And maybe does that kind of remove some of the confusion, some of the chaos, some of the inefficiency that actually happened?
Mm.
Or, of course, the alternative is that, as we know, they still only managed to launch in the time that they had. Even though Titanic, people have this idea that sometimes it sank quite quickly. Actually, it was a relatively slow sinking. They had a
Slow
fair amount of
thinking.
time.
Yeah.
They just didn't use the time particularly well.
Yes.
So on the basis
More
that,
people could have survived as things happened that night
yeah,
if
exactly.
they had loaded the boats more efficiently and calmly, and they had trusted the load capacity of the boats more.
Well, and of
Had
course, had
several more hundred people alive.
well, and of course, we know about the whole women and children first slash only confusion as
Yeah.
well. But there is, as I say, only 18 out of 20 were launched as it stands. So adding a whole more, however many more lifeboats, it's hard to say whether they would have been able to launch them all because some of them, they would have had to have two rows of lifeboats. Could they have got all of that off in time?
It
It's hard.
also would have, yeah, with the Welland davits, which were new to these crew members and they were new to these ships, like, would they have had enough time or known how to properly get a stack, get the next one from the stack down into the davit? That's a complicated process.
Well,
And they did not have drills.
I was just going to say, and we know that they didn't have a drill. So you're kind of, you could double the number of lifeboats they have, but they might still have that panic of, okay, I don't know. Maybe the first lifeboat is already hooked up or whatever, but they've then got to, as you say, like figure out how
The
to get a
other
second
one
one
in.
in and look at how much trouble they had with the collapsible ones. Okay, so they were collapsible and they would in slightly odd positions and places and whatever, but still, there was so much confusion and chaos about how to get those lifeboats sorted that there is a part of me that thinks maybe, having enough lifeboats, doubling them, whatever, doesn't actually help save any more lives. Other than maybe some of those lifeboats could have just sort of floated off the deck as the ship sank, and I guess people could
Well,
have
there
caved in.
there
But
could have been some strategies there. Perhaps as it got later in the evening, they may have realized it was advantageous to, cut ropes, unhook those, allow those to like float off of the ship so that they would potentially help some people after the ship went down. So maybe then you have a few dozen people here and there surviving because they get on ones that float away. I think probably the most reasonable thing, something you just said, is that in this what if there are that many more lifeboats, then perhaps that means they also go out of their way to train the crew a little bit better on these lifeboats. If they know they're going to use the stacking sort of logistics and they're going to have to be rotating in new lifeboats into these davits, perhaps that triggers more safety training, more crew training. So maybe in that what if is inherent that they have to pay more attention to their crew and these boats. And if that's the case, then maybe everybody's a little bit calmer because they know the crew knows how to do this. And if you're it's like what you just said. If you're Thomas Andrews and you know that there are technically enough lifeboats on this ship to get everybody off, maybe you're a little calmer and you go into logistics mode and you start thinking, okay, how can we make this happen? And maybe it takes him about 30 minutes to come up with a new plan, but maybe some new plan works.
well, and I think adding to what you say is that there's a possibility that there's a fair amount of evidence who's to ever say for sure, but there's a fair amount of evidence that Smith ended up in a pretty like catatonic state and was not really kind of providing the leadership that was needed. As we say, if there was no lifeboats, is it possible that people don't panic in the same way and actually the leadership stays in the right place and that Smith can continue to kind of provide the leadership and the orders that are needed? The problem, though, I mean, the other problem, of course, is that the ship sinking, the the tilt. I don't know, again, that the lifeboats could have been lowered. I mean, it's not just time, it's the fact that the ship is obviously sinking at an angle, and that made it really difficult as well. So it's hard. I think I probably lean towards, even if there were enough lifeboats, I just don't think they would have been able to lower them all in time before things just became completely unmanageable. And
There might have been less chaos with passengers too. I had written a note about this and it really ties into what we're saying. Maybe if passengers saw visually that there were still a lot more lifeboats to be loaded, then there would have been way less chaos on everybody's end, and then maybe you would have had more of a single file calm loading on some of these boats, would have gotten more people on. Maybe more families would have been allowed on intact. Maybe women and children wouldn't have been so ironclad if everyone sees, like, wow, looks like we really have plenty of boats here. And so, really, I mean, we'll go through, obviously a few more bullet points here, but I think really my conclusion is that for me personally, it seems as though, yeah, you're talking about maybe several hundred more lives saved from general like calm, like a little bit more of a calm feeling, a little bit more of um a even keeled kind of strategy as they load these boats. People aren't as on edge, but you're still going to end that night with the ship going down the way that it did, and those last few boats are just not going to be launched properly. But I do think that maybe a few hundred extra lives could have been saved, which is valuable. I mean, that's a large number of lives. Even if it's one more, it's important. But I don't, unless we add in another what if, I don't really think that we could be talking about everybody surviving at all.
I think the key thing you said there is that there would be more people saved, but the addition of the lifeboats, it could calm the panic of the passengers and it could do all of that. But there is still going to be at the very beginning the kind of very kind of relaxed attitude towards it all, which kind of wastes the time. And we know that people kind of didn't want to get in. The only thing is that I think would have had a significant impact is what you said about the kind of women and children kind of only first policy. I think that could have had quite a big impact because if they had enough spaces for everybody, would they have just loaded the lifeboats with whoever was right there in front of them?
I think
And that would have helped logistics because then you don't just have a whole lot of men just standing on the deck a bit like, what's
it
going on?
also saves time because you're not siphoning people off.
Well,
You're
and
not
you've also not got the whole like, oh, I'm not going without. You kind of think people just go, just get on. And if there's not space in this one, then I really can get on the next
like the
one.
Strausses just get on, like, oh,
Yeah.
you're an elderly couple, you're a married couple, like, of course you get on together, get on,
It's hard to say how much of that, how much time was wasted with that, but for sure there would have been this back and forth, get on, no. I mean, we know, I was talking to you the other day about that passenger who she went on to become the first woman to produce plays on Broadway.
Yeah.
And she is loosely what the kind of Rose jumping back onto the ship scene is based on. And if you think, well, how much time, if we are to believe this story, she was told by Captain Smith to get onto the lifeboat because if she didn't get on, her husband would have to worry about saving her as well as himself. So those kind of back and forths,
Don't happen
and does that
very
save the flight?
much. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot, yeah, there's just a lot of people would have still lost their lives, but I think there would have been a lot less fear in the air. I think people would have just been proceeding through things more calmly. And I do think they would have allowed full families to get on board these lifeboats, which would have caused I mean, which prevented a lot of pain and anguish and partying scenes. I mean, how long did some of these parting scenes take? I'm sure quite a bit because it's emotional, it's unimaginable and dramatic. So I think it's pretty clear that unless you add in an additional what if of training all of these crew. But even if you do that, you still are working under this limitation of time. So I think it's just mathematically impossible that you are able to load every single one of the people on that ship onto boats unless the sinking takes longer than it did. Um, so after the sinking, we have changes in maritime law, of course. We've talked a lot about this in other episodes too, but it leads to major changes in maritime safety regulations. This includes the requirement for enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew, even though we just made the argument that not wouldn't necessarily save everybody or fix every situation. If the Titanic had already had enough lifeboats and most people survived, the disaster might not have prompted reforms like this. Or at least, there wouldn't have been such urgency, so maybe it would have taken more time. But I would make the argument that that line of thinking still doesn't make room for realizing that, if you're trying to load lifeboats in the middle of a stormy sea, for example, you might lose everybody. I mean, Titanic benefits from the calmness of the night. She benefits from how still the water was that night in the North Atlantic. If the water was not still, you're looking at a completely different story altogether. You're looking at way fewer people surviving, and then you're looking at people potentially not surviving in the lifeboats for the Carpathia to come. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. How do you think that this is a good one for you? How do you think that the public perception of Titanic would have changed if there wasn't such a massive loss of life? Like, say the loss of life for Titanic is 500 people, because there's some crew that refused to get off until everybody was off, and the captain went down with the ship, and maybe there were some third class men that stayed behind to help, or felt like they shouldn't get on, or whatever it may be. Say loss of life is 500. What do you think the general public perception of Titanic becomes in that scenario? How does it change?
Well, Titanic, as we know, was a global media kind of moment and has remained so for over 100 years.
Yeah, was
And
and it is.
yeah, was and remains, and probably will for some time. But when you think about all those headlines, you think about the front pages of practically every newspaper in the world. They all led with how many people had died because I think it was the shock of the loss of life. I think if more people had survived, um, the public outrage, the shock, it's not as strong. I just think that it's still it's probably of its time a kind of cautionary moment, but I just don't think you get that same level of the global sort of fury. And I think the there not being enough lifeboats was really seen, it was sort of emblematic of kind of arrogance and hubris and neglect of the time. And so, yes, anger would still be there, but I think it would be temporarily about the kind of process of evacuation and who was saved. But that kind of media narrative, I think, as we've talked about a number of times, the reason Titanic has endured for so long is because all of those things had to happen in order for her story to hit every single, pressure point and emotional narrative. And with just one of those gone, all of that is sort of lost. And I think the sort of yeah, I mean, for sure, I think Ismay's kind of his vilification for surviving, I think that probably even if say three, four, 500 people die, I think that probably goes away almost entirely. Maybe not completely, and I think Smith probably still has to go down with the ship. But I think the system would fail, the execution, It's not down to a decision that a lot of people at the time and history has kind of, we can debate whether this is accurate or not, but the truth is that at the time in the media and history has since judged Ismay as the one to make that decision. Who knows
Mhm.
whether that really was, whether it was singularly him. But the point is, that's how history has judged him. So he certainly has a slightly less difficult life after Titanic. And I think that blame sort of moves away. The media narrative changes at the time and, in since, TV, film and books and so on and so forth.
And if the, I would imagine if we're down to anywhere from 2 to 500 casualties, I'm sure a good portion of them would have been crew, which is a way that a White Star Line probably could have spun that and say, I mean, like, look, most passengers survived. Like some of our crew went down because that was their noble job and such and such. So I'm sure, like from a PR standpoint, they could have spun it that way if it was mostly crew. But the other interesting thing is that if more people survived, and you have a huge chunk of people surviving from third class, for example, the stories that come out, like we would have such a more vivid sense of what actually happened. And of course, what actually happened would, be changed by that. So maybe not as sensationalist. It's not as sensationalist. Like, oh, well, we waited in a long line and that was scary, but then we got on the lifeboat and we were fine. And so you like it's not you wouldn't it wouldn't be as chaotic and crazy to hear the stories maybe, but we would have the stories of more people and more, more third class particularly and more crew. So it would be interesting.
I think
But
it's for Smith as well. I mean, I don't think the story, as this has been the case many times, I don't think the story of Titanic endures anywhere near as much as it has. I mean, probably actually not at all. It probably doesn't have the media legacy it does. But for in that moment, for sure, things like Captain Smith, um, I think he would be immortalized even more as a hero because I think if he is one of only say 300 or 400 people, if he still makes, as we say in this what if, we are only choosing one thing that changes. So we are still saying that Smith goes down with the ship because we presume that he believes that that is, what you do. Then now he is one of only three, four, 500 people. So his death is even more significant in the sense that, he is one of a smaller number of people, whereas at the moment he's one of 1,500.
yeah.
So I think that that helps. As I say, I don't think that Titanic survives in the same way, kind of as a legacy, but his for sure, his personal legacy in that moment is probably amplified.
Mhm.
Um, and all of the debate around British stoicism and class and all that sort of stuff, which was and is a huge part of Titanic's legacy. That sort of that debate is somewhat toned down because even though first class would probably still have higher rates of survival, the class bias becomes slightly more operational than symbolic. And so all of the kind of, as you say, like it's the sensational part of, well, the whole of Titanic is sensational, but that's why she survives. When you start to take away something like the ultimate sensation of Titanic, which is 1,500 people dying, the huge loss of life of Titanic is sensational by definition. And if you take that away, suddenly all the debates are a bit more nuanced, all the conversations are less dramatic, the headlines are not there, the films are not there, the stories, as you say, I queued for Lifeboat and I got it, and then it was a bit cold for a few hours, and then Carpe they picked us up and everything was kind of bad. Like it's not, you don't have those same dramatic stories. And the
People
things
aren't
are not as
interested in things that aren't dramatic. The people with
yeah.
interested in
Well, I mean, it's like the clickbait of its time, right? Like Titanic was the ultimate clickbait, is what people bought the newspapers, they bought the books. I was just in an exhibition the other day actually where they had it was really interesting artifact they had, which was what they claimed, not the exhibition, but the book was claiming to be the first true account of Titanic.
yeah.
And inside was a canvassing leaflet that, because they were going door to door to sell this book of Titanic. and they were saying when people say to you this question, this is what you should respond. And in there was a whole blurb saying Titanic is the most sensational sea disaster of all time. You know, this book contains only Titanic. It's not one part Titanic and then filled with other stories. You know, it was all about selling this sensational Titanic story. And so that was the clickbait of its time, that they were going door to door, you know, within weeks selling this book that was all about the shock and the
There's a
horror of
movie
Titanic.
there's a movie that's showing within weeks that they've made.
Yeah.
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 Um,
But only because it is so sensational. So I think all of these things kind of take that away. And so it's, you know, even the kind of the reputation of White Star Line is probably salvageable. You know, it's still a tragedy, but it's not as mythic. You know, really, I think it's awful to say, isn't it? Because I mean, for hundreds of people, it's a great thing, but actually for the legacy of Titanic, she's probably lost.
Yeah, and another what if that's really morbid within this is like I mean, one what if we could do is what if the waters that night had been even colder or choppy or stormy? But I'll never do that what if because I will tell you if the water had been stormy and choppy that night, I know exactly what would have happened. Everybody would have died. So that's like the most morbid one you could do, and I'll never do that.
Although you could argue that if it was stormy, they would have seen the water breaking at the iceberg earlier, because
Okay,
that's
well
one of
then
the
it's
things
the
that.
most boring what if ever because either at the very beginning you prove that and then everybody lives or they start to load these lifeboats and it's impossible to load them and they're all overturning and then everybody dies. So it really is the worst one. I think we'll probably avoid that one. But and the other thing too is that with the lifeboats themselves, they are their own vessels. This is the last note I had here to talk about too, is like if there were more lifeboats, would they have been stocked properly? There's reports that a lot of the ones that did exist didn't have torches, didn't have flares, didn't have biscuits, didn't have water. So, the lifeboat question is so multifaceted. But all of this has kind of been based around the assumption that there are more on board and that perhaps they're stocked properly. And then we have to assume that this calm night at sea remains the calm night at sea that it was. And I think that is one thing a lot of more casual Titanic people just simply do not understand, which is that the weather that night, Mother Nature played a huge role in whether anybody survived Titanic. And there are a lot of happy happenstances that night that allow some people to survive, and it could have gone um, the complete other way. And I think I've always thought the miracle of Titanic is how many people did survive, despite how many people did not. And I think this what if highlights a lot of this. Any closing thoughts? I mean, I think we've sort of, and this has been a fun one because it is quite nuanced, but I think we really have mostly proven that I don't think you get 100% survival rate, but maybe you get like a 70% survival rate or something along those lines,
And
possibly.
I think, again, personally for Jay Bridges, mate, it's a big deal. Smith, big deal. Andrews probably feels pretty vindicated. You know, he pushed the lifeboats, he got them, they needed them. Maybe they weren't all able to be used, but he certainly feels, I mean, he was vindicated anyway, but he died. But you know, he sort of feels as perhaps, you know, that he was right to push for it. I think the only thing we haven't properly touched on is White Star Line probably goes on to survive a bit longer. They probably can get away with that
What
happening.
happened? Yeah.
Whether today White Star Line could exist with all the other liners going on, I think you know some of them had to go at some stage. I think the air travel overtaking, I think, just has would have made that route too difficult to kind of to have all of these liners still going at the same time. But I think White Star Line certainly survives a lot longer. And who knows, maybe. I was looking the other day at the greatest loss of life at sea in peacetime, which is, of course, not Titanic. People often think it is, but it is nowhere near. And you know, for many reasons, we don't remember the other ships that had great losses of life at sea. Maybe one of those becomes the Titanic. You know, how many times do you hear rearranging the deck chairs on Titanic, or you know, oh, nothing go wrong? Well, that's what they said about Titanic. You know, all those kind of like embedded kind of cultural moments that we have
Or
when we,
the one that's like the South Titanic. Like we have one that,
yeah.
was found off of, I don't know if it was found off of North or South Carolina, eventually the Pulaski. It's always called the US South Titanic, and it was actually quite similar in many ways. So I get them calling it that.
Well,
Um,
Costa Concordia, which is probably the sort of recent one people would think of when you watch the reports of that, everyone's like, "Oh my God, it was just like Titanic." It was, that it has become such it embodies so much for so many people in so many different situations that in this scenario, that's gone. So maybe another ship
it's like
has that sort of
It's like the Mandela effect. It would be like if the Mandela effect was some people remembered the reference point being Titanic and then it was something else. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
like it's just a one for one. It's how, you might remember something from your childhood as one word or one thing, and then you realize later on it was something else. Like it could have just been as simple as culturally we live with those same memes and the same expressions and jokes and whatever. It's just a different ship instead of Titanic. And that's a strange thought,
Yeah.
like, yeah, like no one in America, maybe people would walk around saying like rearranging the deck chairs on the Pulaski. I don't know, like would that just be something in American culture? Because it was this horrifically devastating thing that happened and a lot of people died and the rescue stories are just insane. That's just one example, but yeah.
But there is,
Um,
I mean, it was the Doña Paz maybe could be, the ship that people talk about. Maybe that's their like that's our go-to cultural reference. But I think the problem is always that Titanic ticked all the boxes in terms like it was, a lot of it is down to the kind of class structure, which, things like that ship didn't have. So yeah, it's another very interesting what if that diminishes Titanic's legacy, saves a lot of lives, but diminishes her legacy.
That's tends to be where we end up.
Yeah.
This is a good segue into letting everyone know that I do have a running list of some what ifs that listeners have submitted. And at the end of this project, at some point in the next few months when we decide to, kind of take a, like put a little nice bow on it and say, okay, we've done this number of episodes. Not that it would be done forever, but well, it's a series. At some point, it'll come to an end. But what I would like to do at the end is basically pick one out of a hat from all of the submissions that we've had from people. So if you have a what if idea that you think would take us in an interesting direction, please submit it. You can always email me or message or comment on Instagram. But I am keeping all of the suggestions that I get, and then we're gonna pick one out of that at the end. It should be fun. What if it's a crazy one?
I would
I,
love that. I
I would
really
love
want
it.
one. I want one that is going to take us like 3 hours to dissect. Like I
Oh, that'll be
really,
the Jack Dawson one, so don't worry.
yes, of course, yeah.
Okay, so I think we've done a beautiful job with this lifeboat episode. I would encourage people to also seek out a recent episode of 99% Invisible, which is a great podcast. They have always done a wonderful work and it's very highly produced. But they did an episode, I guess it was 2 or 3 months ago in their feed, and it was called Titanic's Perfect Lifeboat, and it was an investigation of Titanic as its own lifeboat. And as they always do, they bring in other, themes and they tie it to some other things. But Titanic is definitely the pivot point for that episode. And they brought up some stuff that even as a lifelong Titanic person, I hadn't really thought about in that light. So I think sometimes it's important, even as Titanic people, to go hear what other people are saying about Titanic. Because in this case, it's an investigative team and a seasoned podcaster and seasoned researchers. So they do a really good job. I would highly recommend people checking that out if you want to continue this conversation in your mind. And in the meantime, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast and throw a 5-star review wherever you listen if you have a moment. On Patreon, these episodes go up 3 to 5 days before the main feed, so it's a good excuse to jump on Patreon if you haven't before. And there is, gosh, almost 4 years of bonus episodes there as well. So if you're new to the podcast and you're looking for some bonus content, now is a great time to join because I mean, literally, I think there's something like 30 to 40 bonus episodes just sitting there that maybe you haven't heard. So thank you to all of my current Patreon subscribers. Thank you to all of my listeners. Thank you to Pablo, of course. And we will see you in the next one.